Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm your host today, Reverend Ellie Hutchison, and I am the Minister for Congregational and Community Engagement with the Faith Info team, and we are part of the Love of Church at the national setting of the United Church of Christ. Nurture the Soul is a weekly webinar series that provides our local churches and faith practitioners with multitudes of practical, educational, innovative, and formational resources in order to engage with the critical topics of our time, to center care and the education for the people of God. From cultural and community organizing to congregational leadership, from worship and theology to resourcing small and rural churches, and from ministry with our youth and children to a wide range of justice issues, we feature theologians, guest artists, authors, and key leaders. Nurture the Soul stays current with how our gospel is alive at this time. We hope that Nurture the Soul, that this virtual space is a space for connection, community, and nurture, because we believe in the collective movement towards the world that God imagines for all of us. So join us every Thursday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Nurture the Soul. And from time to time, especially during this election season, we have a lot of special offerings coming your way. You can find these webinars that are upcoming on any of our social media platforms, or you can visit www.ucc.org/events. And beloveds, if what you've heard today, what you hear in these conversations every Thursday move you, if what's offered helps to enhance your ministry or even nurture your soul, please consider donating towards the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting the letters UCC to the numbers 41444. It's your prayerful and financial support that helps programs like this continue to be the essential work of the United Church of Christ. I want to thank you for supporting us, and more importantly, thank you for being with us here today, whether you're joining us live or you're watching this at a later time. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be present with us here. So today we have a really wonderful webinar planned for you. If you've been wondering what the purple church term might be, well, today's session is for you. In a denomination like ours in the United Church of Christ, what does it mean for us to lead a purple church? A church where members range across the political spectrum, and doing so in the midst of a culture that continually tries to divide and silo us. Today, our panelists will explore how this works in rural and suburban settings of the United Church of Christ, as well as how our ministry can be a calling for our larger denomination. And today we're joined by Reverend Mark Pettis, Reverend Dr. Alan Hinton, Reverend Heather Kurtz, and Reverend Laura Folkween. I turn it over to you, Mark. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to all of our speakers. If you want to turn your cameras on, it would be lovely to be here with you all.
Thank you so much, Ellie. It is awesome to be here. As Ellie mentioned, I am Reverend Mark Pettis. I serve in our national setting as the Ecumenical and Interfaith Relations Minister for the United Church of Christ. And I came to this position with experience in what we would call a purple church in Southern California. And being in that position, recognizing that a church with varying political perspectives in the pews can at times be an interesting experience in not only our communities, but in our larger United Church of Christ, where we speak of an extravagant welcome. We speak of welcoming people no matter who they are and where they are in life's journey. And I think we are always challenged to live out that extravagant welcome in the most expansive way possible. And for us in the United Church of Christ, sometimes that means really taking a look at how do we welcome those with differing political views, especially at a time in our culture when um, we are more and more divided, and our go-to is not to embrace others who have views other than our own, but to distance ourselves and perhaps even condemn them. And in our congregations, we need to be more intentional about those relationships. And so today we will talk a little bit about what that means. And we have with us three wonderful leaders who all have UCC backgrounds, and two of whom are serving congregations now, and one who is working with an organization whose mission is to help congregations and groups of people figure out how to be in relationship when we don't agree. And so I want to get right into it, and I want to hand this over to Reverend Dr. Alan Hilton, who is the founder of House United, and I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about that and about his ministry. Alan.
Thanks, Mark. I'm Alan Hilton. I live in Austin, Texas, where I usually fly places. I fly to churches around the country, denominational gatherings around the country, seminaries, to ask together how are we going to be church when we're voting for different people. And so I live in Austin. I work actually half time in a local church that is purple, and so I have some experience. But most of my experience is out in the field, and so my role today, I hope, will be to set the table for Heather and Laura as they talk to us about what they're encountering in and trying to do in their local places. And I'm gonna share my screen to um, to sort of dispel a myth to start. When we ask what is a purple church, a lot of people think, well, a purple church is one where everybody is trying to be moderate and join in some sort of middle space. What's on the screen is a painting by Georges Seurat, who was part of a movement called pointillism. And pointillism is based on the notion that if you put two colors right next to each other on a canvas or on a surface and do that often enough, they will from a distance combine to make the color that the two of them would make if you mix them. But the colors on the painting, if you get close enough, are, for instance, yellow and green if it's blue. That there's a merging in our eye that isn't actually on the canvas. And my experience in purple churches is that there are red people and there are blue people, and there are various degrees of red and blue. But in those churches, what they're not trying to do is make everybody meet in the middle and think the same thing. In fact, they're trying to capitalize on differences. When we really take this out for a spin, the differences become an asset rather than a threat. It's hard to imagine in an election year that we could see differences in whom we're voting for as an asset. But I'm going to talk a little bit about that, about what are the advantages and what is the necessity, in a way, of being a purple church. This is, by the way, the local church that I work with in Austin, and they've done a good job of capturing that pointillist principle. It's red and blue with a lot of overlap that becomes purple, but the people maintain their integrity and their beliefs. 1962 in America, the racial setting at the time, and Martin Luther King was asked to speak at Cornell College in Iowa. This isn't the one in Ithaca, New York. This is the one in Iowa, and it's a wonderful speech. Google it and find it. But his diagnosis of racial dynamics at the time was that I am convinced, in that speech he said that, and I'm gonna say people, I'm convinced that people hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they don't communicate with each other. And they don't communicate with each other because they're separated from each other. And in the church in the United States, we have trended more and more toward red churches or blue churches who gather to agree. And there is something prophetic about being a blue church and advocating. I call them advocacy churches. There's that it allows a level of prophecy that allows you to put up banners and speak sort of almost unanimously on issues. But what purple churches can do is convince their neighborhoods, convince their villages or cities, convince the culture that it's possible not just to coexist with one another, but to know one another and stop fearing one another because we're in relationship, because we communicate with one another. And so MLK's prayer at the end of that speech was, God grant that something will happen to open channels of communication, that something will happen because people of goodwill will rise to the level of leadership. I know a lot of Purple Church pastors through my work, and we're going to hear from two of them in this setting. And there is a goodwill about saying we're going to bring difference together in this space and enjoy one another and learn to do one another. I think it would answer what MLK diagnosed for the racial dynamics in the US, and we might diagnose for the political red-blue dynamics. One of the things that comes when we don't know each other is that we tend to exaggerate the other. The estimated proportion of Republicans and Democrats holding extreme views, when I'm trying to think, more alike is the group that did this survey. The estimated proportion that people spoke when they were asked what percentage of people are extreme was 55, when actually only 30% were extreme. So they were overestimating the extremity of usually the opposition's political position. By knowing each other, we diminish that distance between estimate and actual, because we know people in the room. We're in the room with people. The problem with being separate is that we start to make assumptions about one another. I want to beam in. This is what Pew did this research in 2022 about how we perceive people on the opposite side of the aisle. And I want to beam in on morality and intelligence here. Around just under 70% of us think that people on the other side of the aisle, the question was, are a little more immoral than the rest of us, than usual. And half of us think that people on the other side of the aisle or the issues are just less intelligent. They're more unintelligent than usual people, which points out that if we aren't with one another, we can start to think that the only way someone could disagree with me is if they're stupid or evil, right? And in a purple church, that is not easy to stay with, because you know people on the other side of the aisle. You have a human being in the room rather than a caricature. And that allows a humanizing and an empathic relationship where a lot of us live in a placarding world, in a world where we see the candidate's face on everybody we meet who votes for the candidate. I came from a background that was very mixed. I grew up United Methodist in a sort of nominal Christianity. I became a Christian through Young Life at a camp in Canada, and started to attend Bible study at a Christian church. And I went to vacation Bible school at a Mennonite church. I went to a Quaker college, George Fox University, a Presbyterian seminary at Princeton Seminary. I had the first wine I ever tasted accidentally at a Missouri Synod Lutheran church when I went to the altar and the pastor poured it down me, and I burned my whole throat just burned. I was in concerts with an Assemblies of God church. I, of course, ministered in the United Church of Christ. And to fill out my bingo card, I married an ELCA Lutheran person, Blessed Liz, who puts up with me. And I am made of all those things. And as I experienced each of those places in the world, each of those communities of Christ, I found I never ran into somebody who was trying to get Jesus wrong. There are people with whom I disagreed at every stage, but I never found anybody who was trying to misunderstand, misrepresent Jesus. So these differences, even as I was going along, seemed to me to be actually an asset to me. I got to add to my Jesus in a way. I got to understand Jesus differently because of different perspectives. And that may be why I vibed with John 17 and Jesus's prayer. I pray not for only for these my disciples, I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one. And we'll get back to this, but there is a missional element to Jesus's prayer, so that the world may know that you sent me. And it goes on to say, so that the world may know you sent me and that you love them even as you love me. A purple church has the chance of being an emissary for faith by showing the unity of God through the unity in the church. And as we gather red and blue and love one another across those differences, we become testimony for the character of God according to Jesus's prayer. That's a powerful possibility. One of the indicators that we're on the right path with a purple church is that Jesus had 12 spots, and it seems like terrible HR policy, but Jesus, when he recruited for his disciple group, he's called in the most controversial issue of his day politically, is the people of Israel, the Jews of the first century in Palestine, were constantly trying to figure out, how do we array ourselves relative to the Roman Empire? How do we handle being ruled by Rome? And on one side were revolutionaries, zealots, and on the other side were people who cozied up and worked for Rome and wanted to just sort of go along to get along. And Jesus chose a zealot, a revolutionary named Simon, and a Roman revenue agent called Matthew to be in the same group. That is just odd to me, but it's also beautiful to me. And I have wondered if it didn't bear fruit in this response. Jesus was in his time in Jerusalem not long before he went to trial and crucifixion. He was tested by the Jewish leaders in that place, and they came to him with a famous question. Should we pay taxes to Rome or not? And of course, he gets in hot water with the zealots, the revolutionary sorts, if he says, yes, of course we pay taxes. But he gets in hot water with Rome and the people who are pro-Rome if he says, no, we shouldn't pay taxes. And so here's what he says: bring me a denarius and let me look at it. So they bring him a coin. Whose image is this and whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. And here's Jesus's famous response, which I think was honed around campfires where Matthew and Simon both spoke up. Jesus said, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's, and they were amazed at him. I think that wit and that ability to understand the predicament he was in came from hiring two guys from opposite sides for his disciple group. In 1 Corinthians 12, Paul lists an array of gifts. Famous passage: there are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit distributes them. There are different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of working, but in all of them and in everyone, it's the same God at work. The Corinthian church is divided, and Paul comes at them with the notion that the things they're all good at are meant for everybody. And so that they ought to bring them into play in all their difference and take it out for a spin. And if we broke out in a usual Christian group and started to name, well, what are the gifts that Paul didn't name, because he doesn't have a comprehensive list in 1 Corinthians 12. What are the gifts he didn't name? Would anybody name being conservative or being progressive by nature? And yet there's a lot of research with identical twins separated at birth, there's a lot of research that says we are oriented to the world from birth genetically in a more protective, tradition-loving, more risk-averse way in some of us, and others more risk-welcoming and more the latest thing is the best thing. We are inclined differently from birth. These seem to me like gifts of God that we have given up if we start thinking that the real true Christians are blue or the real true Christians are red. By bringing both into play, we have a shot at maximizing the giftedness that we have in God. I'm going to speed through these. Military people get this. Tribe is a book by Sebastian Junger where he features the multi-form nature of units in the army or in the military. He was embedded in troops in Afghanistan and Iran and in Iraq and came back just highly appreciating the closeness of those groups, even as they were different religiously, culturally, racially, politically. Sports gets it. They are trying for the same thing. So if they disagree on who they vote for, they kind of set it aside or they get through it. Larry Fitzgerald, a Hall of Fame receiver, wrote an article for Sports Illustrated saying sport can help us heal because of that element. Business gets it. Business knows that in order to make really good widgets, you have to have different ways of looking at the world in the room. And this is Scott Page from University of Michigan, who's written extensively on it. Strength Finders is Gallup's tool for trying to find out how strengths in a group can be maximized and the differences can be maximized. So I'm going to skip this one. And so we get a sense that in many places in our culture, people get that difference works, but in church we tend not to, because we have convictions, we have ideas. There is a sort of mantra in the blue and red churches that I work with that empathy is not endorsement. Because sometimes we feel like if we relate empathically with someone, we are endorsing their point of view. That's a dangerous assumption. It's very possible to be empathic. This is Dylan Marone. I'm just going to commend his TED talk to you. It's called Empathy is Not Endorsement. He's a rock and roll guy. He's very good. And he found ways to engage people who were very vehemently against what he was saying and just talk to them and learn them and meet them. I'm gonna sort of stop sharing my screen now and come to a close so I can hand the baton on to Heather. Purple churches have a chance to be missional in the world, have a chance to show the character of God as different, triune, different but unified. Purple churches have a chance of putting out a shingle for helping our communities figure out how to navigate one another. I'll close with a story. Wellesley, Mass. I had done 3 or 4 courageous conversations in Wellesley, Mass. And the church there was mostly blue, kind of red, but they talked very well together across those lines after we practiced a bit. An issue arose in the city about whether they were going to have Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day. And it was a fight. And in the town council, it was a fight. And so finally, when they nearly had fisticuffs in the Board of Select people, they threw it out to the town and said, why don't you talk about it? So the pastor of the church I had been working with, Sarah Butter, called me and said, Alan, why don't you come in, facilitate a conversation on this, and we'll do what the town council said. So we had 120 people in this little chapel crowded in because it was a controversial issue. And they navigated it and talked with one another extremely well, extremely respectfully, without pulling punches. They were very honest and convicted about what they thought. They got to the end, and several town council members approached the pastor and said, we need you to do more of these because we don't know how. What if churches became sort of resources to our community at being able to talk with one another and love one another across difference? it might actually save the world. That's what I got. Heather?
Thank you, Alan. That was enlightening. I appreciate your words, and I just want to say thank you, Mark, for inviting me to this time as well. I'm Heather Kurtz. I've been ordained in the United Church of Christ for 23 years. I like to say that I have worked in the 4 branches out of the 5 branches in the United Church of Christ. So I've been all over the country in churches, in various churches. Currently, I'm at Zion United Church of Christ here in Arntsville, Pennsylvania. We're a rural area of 900 people. I have farmers that grow apples, and I have CEOs and people who work for Hershey as well. And we are about 8 miles from Gettysburg. So that brings a rich history to our church as well. So when I was thinking about a purple church, our church is definitely a purple church. And I was thinking, why are we a purple church? How do people feel about this? So the first thing I did, I started asking my congregation questions on Sunday, and they had to fill out papers. So I wanted to see their feedback. So the first question that I asked them is, what do you value about your relationship at the church? And I was so surprised by the responses. I never did like questions to my congregation before, but I thought, why not? And the answers for me were really stunning and wonderful. They know as a congregation that they can support one another, that they're there at any time. They love the love that is felt in the congregation. And I think that helps define them as a purple church, because they do support each other and they're so close. So that was an easy question to start off with. The second question that I asked them, which was more interesting to me, was, what justice topic is important to you and why? And I never asked that question in a church. And the responses I got through and through was that the church cares about other people. That is the bottom line. They want that connection. They care about each other. They care for people outside the community. And I was really surprised. And some of them said, what do you mean? What's a justice issue? So I started by telling them an example on Sunday morning. And I said, I'm going to tell you an example about creation, like why we should have creation justice. And that recycling is important to me. And, we want to keep this earth really wonderful for future generations. But I didn't get anything about care. I got about a variety of topics, and they were all dealing with people. So I found it really fascinating when it came down to justice issues, that is their go-to. They care about each other and they care about the community. So I think for us in our church, mission helps us to be a purple church. This is a huge mission church. We reach out, and this kind of goes with what you were saying, Alan. We reach out to the community. We feed children every week that are in school. We have, because we're around apple orchards, we have a huge migrant population here that picks our apples, that helps the farmers pick the apples. They care about the migrants. They care about the children that go to school who don't have food to eat. And I think that's what defines us too as a purple church. Those pieces for us, getting outside the walls and then going and helping others, helps us stay grounded in the Spirit of God, helps us stay who we need to be as a church. And Alan, I'm snagging one of your quotes because I thought it was really wonderful. I love this quote that you mentioned. They don't communicate with each other because they are separated from each other. And I think for our small church, really like living into that, communicating with each other is a key to how we run as a church. And so when I got into this church and I thought, how as a minister can I keep them connected with each other? And how can I keep them a purple church? And so for me, one of the ways that I find that important is through family systems. So I help them stay connected. And I think even when we disagree, because we can all disagree on items, I think staying connected as a minister, keeping keep going with the person, talk to the person. And I think oftentimes, sometimes, I shouldn't say oftentimes, sometimes what happens is we decide that maybe we should distance ourselves because somebody doesn't agree with us, or what should we do with that, right? So I think you always need to lean in, right, to learn what the congregation is saying. And that's where I land. What can I learn from them? How can they help me in this time to learn? I always think of, I always use this as an example, and they always laugh at me, but my congregation does. But I always say, if you ever watched Columbo, Columbo would always say, "Oh, just one more thing," right? So, and I always think about that as a minister. Ask the good questions, keep asking the questions, be intrigued, because I think that opens them up to talk about the hard issues. So I find asking those questions is important. And there are moments when sometimes an issue comes up in our church, and I want to just mention this, and I don't know if this will be helpful, but I always think you have to be hard on the issues, right? And soft on the people. So you stay connected to the person, right? But you might not like the issues. So maybe you don't agree with the issues, right? But you stay soft on the people and you stay connected with the people. And I think that's an important piece for me. Family systems has helped me with that. And right now, so what we're doing, because I know this is an anxiety-filled moment in our church anyway, because we are in Pennsylvania, I'm going to ask if we can put the book slide up there then. And then that I sent in, we're reading a book called Everything Isn't Terrible. And it's all about anxiety. So for us in the Purple Church, I wanted to make sure that we talk about anxiety, because anxiety comes out in weird ways. You never know what you're going to get. So I have a group of people reading that, and it's the same group that I always get. But what I'm finding out is a lot more people are starting to read the book. And they're like, Heather, we're reading the book. I'm like, okay. So we're talking. And I think it just engaging the congregation where they are in a Purple Church and leaning into that is very important. So I just wanted to recommend Everything Isn't Terrible by Kathleen Smith. It does come from a family systems point of view, and you'll see some of that piece, but that has been helpful for us when we're talking about being a Purple Church, and especially with the elections coming up. The other thing that I did find out that I was really fascinated about, since I started asking these questions, people are talking to me more about politics, and they find that everybody is okay talking about it. Everybody can have their own opinion about where they are with things, and that's okay. And we can still get along. And it's been interesting. Like one of my oldest members said to me the other week, Heather, this is how I'm voting. I didn't ask. This is how I'm voting. I'm like, okay, Joe. And he's like, and this is why. And he said, but we don't have to agree. I said, no, we don't. He said, but it's just good to talk about it because we need to have more conversation. And I think that's the important part for our churches, to keep being inquisitive, to keep asking the question, to keep engaged with our churches. So for me, I always do think about that Columbo. I always try to stay connected with the people who are, not sure what's going on or a little bothered, but always staying connected in that family systems. And I feel blessed to be in a congregation that has such diversity. One of the coolest things that we were in a consistory meeting the other week, and our president said, we don't all have to agree with each other. We can disagree, and that's okay. And I think that's the type of conversation that we need in our churches. So thank you for coming and to this time. And Laura, I'm going to turn it over to you at this point.
Awesome. Thank you, Heather and Ellen and Mark. It's just really good to be together. And I'm grateful to have been invited to speak today. I still am not sure if I am the right person to be added to this conversation. But here we are. So, Laura, if you want to share my PowerPoint, we were talking beforehand. I use a PowerPoint presentation to keep myself on track, make sure I don't really go off down a side road, because there are lots of those in Montana where I live. I am the pastor at Pilgrim Congregational UCC in beautiful Bozeman, Montana. This is the front of our church. And I think that US flag and the pride flag hanging next to each other really just shows the world that we're a purple-ish church. I would say that we're probably more bluish purple. And that also, I just want to be very honest about that in my remarks, that I offer them in so much humility, because what I'm sharing is, I think, my best efforts to bring people together, and our congregation's best efforts. And we certainly don't always live up to those. I've been the pastor at Pilgrim for 3 years. I started out as the designated interim and was called as settled pastor just about a year ago. And there's a picture in my presentation of my installation Sunday this last February. In our sanctuary, which has purple carpet and purple windows. So what are we going to do? But be a blue and red makes purple kind of community. It's in our architecture. It's in our design. I want to share a little bit with you about our context in Bozeman, because I think that's important. I was going to say I'm coming from a mostly rural context, and compared to the rest of the country, yes, but not compared to Heather in very small rural Pennsylvania. Montana still doesn't quite have a population over 1 million people, and Bozeman has seen itself as a little ski town and a little university town in Montana for a really long time. We're the home of Montana State University, and the church was founded in the early 60s, right down the street from the university. So we have, since our beginnings, really valued freedom of thought in UCC tradition, freedom of conscience, and kind of intellectual dialogue, grappling. That's really part of who we are. But Bozeman has also really grown. We are not a little ski town anymore. Our population in the last 20 years has grown by about 30,000. And since in the last 10 years by about 20%, and even more in the outlying Gallatin County. So in our purpleness is also just some tension in terms of population growth. And I think more diversity of political perspectives, of racial ethnic identities, than probably Bozeman has lived with before. So we're experiencing some of those growing pains. And I really see our church as we're facing an opportunity to be a leader in bringing people together. If we can rise to the occasion, and I totally have faith that we can. That's our context. Next slide, Laura. As I'm here at Pilgrim following a pastor who was here for 41 years. I've been here for 3. I'm the first female pastor, and I'm the first LGBTQ pastor here. So just by walking in the door, I've changed a lot of things and challenged a lot of people in the congregation who aren't used to having a woman pastor, who really aren't used to having an LGBTQ pastor. But with Alan and Heather, my foundation for my ministry, and I think a huge value of the congregation, is on relationship. That I know that I have to meet people and love people exactly where they are. And I love doing that. That's part of a call to be a pastor. And so I've kind of walked in the door with plenty of naivete, but also a commitment to be in relationship and to help people nurture their relationships with each other and with our wider community, which they had already been doing long before I showed up. So we're in this period of kind of refining our identity, and this is our new vision statement that we're pretty excited about. And that last line especially, to offer an authentic, inclusive welcome to all, and to be this open-minded Christian and spiritual community. There are all kinds of spaces in that vision statement that I see for difference, for us to wiggle around within, and to allow each other to be who we are, and also to make space for a relationship. The next slide. I would also just emphasize with my colleagues that the temptation to squelch conflict and to kind of make sure that everybody agrees on everything is a trap. It is nothing but a trap. And if we can get to a place that in this moment in our country's history is so countercultural, to appreciate our differences and to value them, I think that that's gospel work. It's very much the calling of the church in this time. So some things that help us to keep ourselves focused. Nurturing the relationships, I've already talked about that. Allow and celebrate difference. We're an open and affirming church, and I think that the open and affirming movement actually really leads the way for showing us how to adapt to difference and welcome difference and stay curious about how we are different, and not to make assumptions about each other. So we've raised a couple of genderqueer and trans kids in our congregation who are deeply, deeply loved. And when they changed their names and their gender identities, of course, there was some like, oh, what? I knew this kid as this person with this name, and now they're this person with this name. But we did it. And now when this young person comes back for Christmas and stands up with their family and reads scripture, they are who they are, and they're loved for exactly who they are. And I actually think rather than seeing open and affirming identity as a wedge, we can use that journey as a strength and as an example for how we can be together, and how we can be together even when things are changing. So with that said, I want to tell you a story from about a year and a half ago. I will tell you that I kind of came blazing in and really excited to serve an open and affirming congregation, a larger church in Bozeman. We have about 150 members. And I said, well, let's do open and affirming Sunday, and let's go. Our church had been tabling and walking in pride parades for years and years and years. So I was not introducing that, but bringing it into the sanctuary, I think, was something new and different. And so there were questions. Why are we having Pride Sunday and not celebrating Veterans Sunday in as big a way? And at first I was a little taken aback by that and was like, really, the culture wars are here and we're gonna fight it out. But actually, taking a step back and taking a breath, I realized it was a really good opportunity for us to have this conversation. And so I said, well, let's talk about this in our spiritual life team, who helps to plan worship and helps to plan themes and what Sundays we are observing and how, especially if they're beyond the liturgical calendar. And our spiritual life team said, well, let's do both. Of course we should do both. And the way that I observe any of our military holidays is to pray deeply and fervently for peace, and to recognize and be very grateful for folks who have served in the military, and to recognize grief for all of the loss that comes with war. And that, to my knowledge, has been accepted pretty well. And the other thing that is real in our congregation is that there are actually members of the LGBTQ community who are also veterans. So being willing to see and recognize and understand and embrace those kinds of intersectionalities is also, I think, a gift of a Purple Church, is that you're not asked to leave one part of who you are at the door in order to celebrate another part of who you are, but that we can recognize all of this and all of you on our best days. So I'm really proud of that story, and that we were able to work that out in that way. And the next slide, if you want advice, this is what works for me. And I think for our congregation as we move forward together. This statement on the upper left of the screen, I really believe that the gospel should be making everyone uncomfortable, regardless of your political affiliation or views or leanings. Jesus' message to us and the whole of Scripture is incredibly challenging most of the time. So what I do is to stick to the text, is to preach from the text the best way I know how, and with deep prayers for the Spirit's moving and inspiration, and to strive for equal opportunity, challenge, and discomfort, so that not only the more conservative people in our community will be challenged all the time, but also folks who think they're right on the other side of things. We should all be grappling and challenged by Scripture. That middle circle there, use the decision-making structures that you have. I think the example of the spiritual life team making the decision about our Sunday observances is really important, that it's not just me. I think some people got really excited when I showed up and was pretty clear about my values. And that's great, that felt good. But in the congregational model of doing church, right, we really value a lot of voices on the decisions. And so I do take things as often as I can to a team and get some more ideas. How will this work? What are the possible pitfalls? How will the community feel about this? And then similarly, to what Heather was saying, like the foundation of this is love for each other. No matter who you are or where you are in life's journey, we will bring you soup when you're sick. We will try to raise money to help you fix your vehicle or find the best organization in town to refer you to and help you through the process. That's what's important. And also not assuming that everyone agrees, that the person who's overhearing your conversation during coffee hour agrees with you. And to be curious about that instead of turning to only find the people who do agree with you. And then other thing I'll say is that the church is political. I say this a lot. The root of the word political is polis, which means people. So wherever the people are gathered, there will be politics. It will be political. And the question is, what do we do with that? And how do we love each other through it and listen and seek to understand? And I also say a lot that it does take everybody. I'm not really interested in being in a church of people who are all the same. I'm very interested in being in a church where we're different and we use those differences to our strength. And then just the 501c3, the church still has nonprofit tax status, which means that by law, I mean, we risk our tax status if we are being partisan, if we are supporting specific political candidates, or kind of playing to party politics. What we can do is talk about issues and how our values lead us to vote and act on issues. And I think that's really exciting and where the conversation can get very exciting, if we're ready to go there. And I think we also have to set ourselves out some parameters and learn, because we're not great at it, to listen, to act with respect in those conversations, to take a breath, to, when you feel like lashing out and giving a diatribe, that's probably not your time to talk. Like, that's your time to take a breath and to step back and listen a little bit more. And actually, I also think that that's a place where we could be poised to really teach the rest of the community how to do those things. The example that Alan mentioned is so, so good, with our public leaders saying, please help. There's just so much that we can offer the wider community if we are able to begin to be a little microcosm of those kinds of communities that offer care and that are in training as really good listeners, people who can make decisions together across difference. And then my last slide is this great quote. It comes from my United Methodist roots, perhaps, but it's also very frequently misattributed to John Wesley. In essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; in all things, charity. I just think those are such good words to live by in a purple church, in a divided country. It's important to figure out what our essentials are and who we are, and to stick to that and be clear and celebrate that, to let some things go. And then for the bottom line, to be caring and compassion and giving each other grace and space. So thank you. Those are my remarks. I'm really interested in more conversation and questions.
This was wonderful. I loved every bit of it. I loved how we started out with the biblical. I find that sometimes when we are in this world and we are navigating our political ideologies and theories and all of that stuff, that we often forget to return back to scripture. And so I love that. And you all touched on that. And so I'm grateful that the pastors are doing the pastoring. Thank you for that. That is beautiful. We do have a question, and I want to invite others to include questions if they would like. In the bottom of your screen, there is a little dialogue box that you would have seen back in the day with the cartoons, the little bubble that pops up, and it has a question mark in it. You can click on that and you can go ahead and type in the question. We do have a question that came in. It said, how do you deal with people who come in wearing political t-shirts or speak vehemently about their beliefs in hopes of changing another person's opinion? I'll let that open to whomever. And not all at once.
I'll go ahead and say a word about that. People are passionate in their beliefs, and they are taught to placard about that. I mean, you need a sign up if you're really committed, or you need a t-shirt on, and you need the swag. Outlawing that or chastising it feels a little bit like another kind of uninclusive Christianity, but it can be an opening to a conversation, right? Anything can be an opening to a conversation. How do we feel about people among us wearing campaign gear? How do we, as a congregation, it opens the door for a courageous conversation, not to vilify the person, but to say, this is a person with strong convictions. Let's talk about this together. How do we, is it something we want to covenant with one another that you can do it, or that you can't do it? We aren't campaigning in the congregation. I think anything we can throw out to the community and say, we disagree about things, why don't we talk about that thing? Helps the group build muscles and may arrive at policy that matters, actually.
Thank you, Alan. Heather?
I guess for me too, it's how do we love the person, and how do we reframe that question too? Because if they're trying to get other people's opinion, like to change people's opinions, right? How do we meet each other where we are? How do we dialogue? So I guess that's where I would go with that. You don't. I agree with Alan on what he said. I think it's just about loving the person, loving the others. We all, and I think this goes back to what Laura had mentioned briefly too. I mean, we all come with different gifts, different abilities, and different opinions. And I think lifting all of those up is okay, but we all are individuals, right? And we all have different opinions, and that's okay to have different opinions. So we don't want to necessarily try to get other people's opinions swayed either. So I guess that's a hard question. I'm just going to acknowledge that too. I mean, that's a hard question and a hard place to be. And I know I served one of those churches, so I will say that. And it was hard, and it was hard for me because I had somebody that would try to do that, and I just kept loving on them. That's what I had to do, and kept talking to them and staying connected with them. And we had that one person, I would call them and I would have conversations all the time with that person. And it was just, we would share each other's opinion. And that's what I have to say. It's not probably what you necessarily want to hear, but you just keep staying connected and let them know you still love them as your minister.
Oh, I love that. Thank you, Heather. Laura, did you want to add anything? I'm trying to read body language and I can't tell if I'm unmuting or not.
I I like my t-shirts, so I wouldn't ask somebody not to wear what they want to wear to church or anywhere else. Um, and I do think it's an invitation to conversation, and I would start the conversation by saying, I want to learn more about you. And when you're trying to change other people's minds, I would just continue to say, well, tell me about your conviction. It seems like you're really excited and passionate about this candidate or this issue. I'd like to hear about how you got to that viewpoint. Just those hashtag stay curious can do us so much good. And then I also think there's a time where you could maybe just ignore it. Choose your approach. And if it just is like a thing that's just constant, 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 I don't think you have to respond to it every single time. Again, see the person. I prefer not to comment on people's clothing or appearance. I'd like to say, how was your week? What's good? Thanks for making coffee. Really, really glad that you shoveled snow. Really, really glad that you shoveled snow this morning.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that. Thank you for sharing. I have one final question before we go out, and this is a personal question for each of you. Oftentimes, when we are in caretaking roles, pastors, faith leaders, practitioners have multitudes of roles that they play. And that is both our personal and professional lives. And in purple churches, where we are finding ourselves siloed and conditioned to just hold steadfast to our belief, I wonder, how is it that you care for yourself? What are you doing to care for yourself? Because if you're not being cared for, then the love that you want to give so freely, while it is given out, we can't continue to burn out pastors, right? We've known since 2020, we have seen just a drastic decline of people who have retired, and seminaries closing doors because they don't have enough people that can understand how to do this work and balance the care for others and the care for themselves. So how are you finding yourself at this moment caring for yourself?
This is an easy question for me because I feel like I'm all over this. So I have a group of friends, and we get together about every other month, and we hang out together, and they're all clergy, and we've been doing it for over 10 years. So I have a great team of support. But the other way I do it is around food. I really love food. So because we have a lot of farms around here, this sounds so bizarre. Everybody thinks I'm weird, but I don't really care. So I go apple picking because they don't have enough migrant workers to help with the apple picking. So when I have free time, I pick apples. And I pick, like the other week, I was picking peppers for people. So my farmers just don't have the help. So it puts me in a place that I can just zone out, and I don't need to like talk to anybody, and I can just be one with the earth. So I feel like that. And then I love cooking. So I take cooking classes. So it's all around food and friends. And I think that feeds my soul. It's taken me a long time to figure out how to feed my soul, but that just keeps me going and making sure I manage my time in the church and taking my time off when I need to and saying no, and not going to every committee meeting. Just being okay. Sometimes that's the hardest thing to do, but I just like step around. And so, yeah, I could write a whole book on how to take care of myself. So, but thank you for that question, Ellie. I appreciate it.
That's a great question. Clergy should be asked this question daily. And other caregivers too, not in a harassing kind of way. I will say this on the internet. I have a regimen of weekly commitments. I meet with a professional coach once a month. I meet with my therapist once a month. I'm forming a little pod with a couple of friend colleagues. We're probably going to start gathering once a month. I participate in a community of practice that's facilitated by a UCC clergy person. I'm just a little bit religious about that because I know I need it. I know I need an outside place to talk. That's my mode. That's just for me. And yes, I will pay people so that I can do that. And I also live in Montana. Being outside is actually absolutely crucial. There's no such thing as bad weather, just bad clothes. So I bundle up and make sure that I get outside, even if it's just for 10 minutes. And that's a newer commitment, a renewed commitment for me, to just get my feet on the ground and get my lungs breathing outside air. Somehow makes everything else seem smaller. I'm so fortunate. I mean, I have mountain ranges all around me. And so just to go outside and look at the mountains, look at the sky, celebrate the sunset helps so very much.
So, pastoral work is draining and constant. The specific part of that I do is almost always conflict related because I go into communities and help them talk about stuff they disagree on, and it can get pretty lonely. Not because I'm connected with the churches with whom I'm working through a pastor I'm a friend to, or I went to Mark's church when he was in Manhattan Beach, and I have friends, buddies who are inviting me, but the work itself can get a little lonely uh, because I stand between. And I found that I would come home and resort to I'm a West Wing fan, the television program The West Wing, and I would come home and I didn't realize what I was doing, but I would come home and on Monday, after having been in a church Saturday and Sunday and since Friday probably, I'd wake up, I'd put The West Wing on, and I'd watch till I wept because it was presenting idealism. It was presenting, and Sorkin writes left and right pretty well. He writes the engagement pretty well, and then after that, it became Hamilton's first act. There are certain ways that I take refuge in good art. In these cases, good screen art. Um, but I have found lately, because I've only been working in this church where I'm sitting now in Austin, Covenant Presbyterian Church. I've only been working here for 8 months. And it's the first time during my time as a consultant and a facilitator and full-time work as a House United guy, first time that I've had a home team. And so I work here half time, and they pray for me and with me, and I actually have people. Now they aren't on the road with me, they aren't, but I have a place to come home, and that has made a lot of difference on my level of loneliness or of feeling drained. There's a replenishment in that and my 12-year-old Labradoodle. And my wife Liz. So yeah, the new sources of replenishment are a nice thing.
Yes, I love that so much. I love all of what you have shared. And thank you. Thank you to each of you, Heather, Laura, Alan, Mark, for making this panel possible, this conversation possible, for our tech team on the other side to make sure everybody's PowerPoints were shown and all of that. But I want to invite you. This is for you who is zooming in with us live and or later. It's okay to be in conflict. If we continue to avoid conflict, then nothing changes while everything changes, right? And so I invite you to tap into those spaces of joy like our dogs, like our mountains, like our food, like our family, friends, TV shows, scripture, prayer, meditation, swimming, exercise, and for all things, holy rest. Tap into those things, but don't do it to avoid conflict because it's happening around us. Our still speaking God asks us to do that. Still speak. Right? And we have representatives today, we have representatives next week, and we're going to have a whole bunch of webinars for as long as I can talk about that are inviting us to be uncomfortable so that way we can be a better version of ourselves. You'd be surprised at how much, and this is I'm not sharing this advice solely as a, hey, it's a person on a screen far away. Me engaging in really difficult conflict that I know is going to be hard, and I know I may walk away hurt, but I develop my plan. How am I going to deal with when I hear or see something that makes me uncomfortable? And then I invite myself to breathe. Because initially, my initial reaction is always the wrong reaction. Always. In my world, not saying that's for anybody else. Right? And because we are people of God, let's return to our scriptures. Let's remember what Jesus did. I guarantee that the people on the other side of the table seeing it flipped were really uncomfortable. And yet they followed. Amen. Thank you all for joining us today and always. I just was so blown away. I had goosebumps from today and yesterday's Nurture the Soul. I want to thank you for joining us. Thank you for the presenters. What a gift you are to us and to your congregation and the world around you. And we look forward to seeing you all again next week, again at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the second part of our two-part series. And this is called Living Our Extravagant Welcome, Multiple Religious Belonging. We are witnessing an increase in our culture of individuals and families who practice or identify with more than one faith tradition. Is there room in our congregations to welcome and embrace these people and families? And how does this look in different settings of our church? Next week, our guest will speak about this present and growing reality in our churches from different varying perspectives and discuss how it's a larger part of our extravagant welcome. Beloveds, I want to say thank you so very much, and I'm going to turn it over to one of the panel members to offer us a benediction and take us out.
I'll give that a shot. And I'll share with you a benediction that my father, who was a UCC minister, shared most every Sunday in his congregations. And I say, love the people, love the earth, love the universe, and do nothing that violates the God in you or the unity that exists, though it may remain unseen. Amen.
Siblings in Christ, if you are moved by this conversation, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry or has nurtured your soul for the journey, please consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help to provide programs like this, which are an essential part of our ministries in the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed on your journey and know that you are not alone. We are holding you in prayer. Amen.